hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. M. David Litwa, and today we'll be discussing his book titled Found Christianities, Remaking the World of the 2nd Century CE. So it's good to have you back on History Valley podcast, Dr. Litwa.
Yeah, it's great to be back. As I said, you're incredibly productive and really appreciate the opportunity to come.
And I appreciate you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about the world of 2nd century CE Christianity?
Well, some people have likened it to a laboratory. I liken it to a jungle. It's really anybody's game. Remember at this time that Christianity is technically illegal, and there's nothing like a creed or a canon, and there's nothing like a church magisterium, if you're familiar with the Roman Catholic tradition. There's not even any church buildings because, again, that would draw attention. So everybody is meeting in private households, which is maximum about 40 people per household. So we're not talking about large groups, and all the groups aren't able to meet together. So in a big city like Rome, you might have 200 house churches with 30 to 40 people each. And that creates a lot of diversity, as you might imagine. You know, if you think about modern American Christianity, you know, it meets in different churches. And frankly speaking, you know, depending on what church you go to, you're going to get a fairly radically different message. And we have all these sorts of denominations, obviously, today. But in antiquity, you didn't have denominations per se, but you did have strong leaders who would guide the community. And as you might imagine, these leaders had a kind of power to determine what they wanted to say. And since there was no New Testament, and if there wasn't a New Testament, there wasn't an Old Testament, then they were still using books familiar to us today, but not reading them all together and not thinking that they were definitely inspired or unchangeable. And they were using the insights of their day, philosophy, art, and all other sorts of mechanisms by which, by the time we come to the 2nd century, they were trying to sort of up their game and institutionally become elite, we might say. So I would say the 2nd century is also the century where most of the New Testament is written. And the very fact that the New Testament is written is part of this elite game of producing elite literature, the kind of literature that other people would take notice of, including biography and these very highly literary epistles. Most of the New Testament is epistles, but you've also got, in the genre of history, you've got the Acts, you know, which most people would view as a kind of early church history in the very broad ancient sense. And then they finally, by the time we get to the 4th century, tack on an apocalypse. So at any rate, this is a very exciting century to be in. It is the century in which Christianity was invented. And that is plain and simple the truth. If you're looking for Christianity in the 1st century, you're kind of looking at a black hole because nothing survives. And there's not a whole lot of evidence. As you know, there's not even a whole lot of evidence for Jesus. And people take different, perspectives on that. And all we have of Paul are 7 genuine letters. And that's about it for the 1st century. All the other stuff is second.
So you're saying that besides these 7 letters that were written by Paul in the 1st century, before 70 CE, the rest of the New Testament is 2nd century CE, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly.
That's exactly right. That's my view. Yeah. Christianity is invented as an institution in the 2nd century. And the Christian Bible, that is the distinctly Christian Bible, was also invented in the 2nd century. And most of those texts were also written between the early and the late 2nd century.
How much of it was written after Marcion, and how much of it was written before Marcion?
Well, in my view, you have to date each individual document based on a set of criteria, and they're all over the map. And I think that if we're going to use the case of Marcion, my theory is that Marcion has a gospel which he used as a boy, and he brought with him from Pontus to Rome. And he transcribed this gospel, and he was the very first one to attach it to a collection of Paul's letters. He didn't invent the collection of Paul's letters, but he attached the gospel to Paul's letters, and he created the very first canon, that is a list of books to which no other books can be added. And these lists of books were held to be the ultimate authority in all Christian knowledge and discourse. And that was an 11-book canon, a gospel plus 10 letters to 7 churches. So obviously the genuine letters of Paul were written and collected prior to Marcion, and he had a gospel which was written prior to him, and probably other gospels like Matthew and John appeared in the early 2nd century. Mark, maybe, I would say on the very cusp of the transition from the 1st to 2nd century. And what happens after Marcion is there's a kind of response for the early Catholic or incipient Catholic Church, in which they don't eliminate Paul, but they try to absorb Paul and then add to him. So after Marcion, there's a series of other Pauline letters that are written that are called the pastorals, in which every critical scholar agrees that these were not written by Paul. And they seem in part to respond to Marcion, and specifically Marcion's book, The Antitheses. In 1 Timothy 6:20 refers to the antitheses of falsely called knowledge. So that seems to suggest awareness of Marcion's work. So that would indicate that these texts are post-Marcion, which would be about 150. They're written in Marcion's lifetime, and they're actually responding to Marcion. And then the way that the early Catholics manage things is that they try to absorb Marcion's Paul, but they add the pastorals, and they also add a new history of Paul's life, and that is the book of Acts. And this book is a kind of what I would describe it as implicitly anti-Marcionite history. That is, it tries to show that Paul was actually quite connected to Judaism and promoting things like circumcision, when it suited him. And I think this was directly in opposition to Marcion's view of Paul as a law-breaking and not law-abiding Christian. We don't know if this term Christian was used by Marcion, but what I'm trying to say is that Paul had made a decisive break with Judaism, and that the message of Jesus was no longer a form of Judaism. And this was Marcion's main point. But when we get to the book of Acts, there's this overwhelming attempt to try to reconnect Paul back to Judaism, to say that he did, in fact, follow the law on occasion, that he took a Nazirite vow, that he even circumcised Timothy, which is something that is probably not true, but that's what the author of Acts says. And then the author of Acts was probably the same person who added the first 2 chapters to Luke and produced canonical Luke, in which, again, just as he did for Paul, he does for Jesus. He roots Jesus into the history of the Old Covenant or Old Testament, as you were, creating a birth narrative in which Jesus is tied to the house of David and reigns as the Messiah over the house of Jacob, and is connected to all these Old Testament canticles and themes. And even the language is highly Septuagintal, which, the Septuagint, again, is the Greek Christian Old Testament. And so this author is quite deliberately trying to connect both Jesus and Paul to Judaism. And what that does, that has an effect. The bandwidth of the authoritative books is expanded, and Christians are become sort of, shall we say, confirmed in their anti-Marcionite biases that, yes, Jesus and Paul are Jews, and they act as Jews in their time, and it's okay to selectively choose from Jewish rites and Jewish prophecies, and to essentially to assimilate the Judaism to Christianity, or shall we say, culturally appropriate the treasures of Judaism and present them as Christian, while also selectively getting rid of those other things that Christians never really liked, such as the ritual law of sacrifices. And they weren't killing goats and sheep, but they did like the prophecies. And there's a concerted effort by Christians late in the 2nd century to try to reconnect their religion to Old Testament prophecy as a kind of confirmation of its truth. We see this especially in Justin's dialogue of Trypho and Melito's book on the Pascha. At any rate, more can be said, but I don't want to totally let that question dominate. I'll be having a series, or I'll be opening up my new course on Marcion, hopefully very soon, in a matter of days, in which I go through more thoroughly my views on Marcion and what came to be known as the New Testament. So stay tuned for that.
And what do you make of Marcion's collection of Paul, the Apostolicon? Do you think Acts is aware of Marcion's version of Paul's letters? And could that have been problematic in the sense of Acts knowing the original collection of Paul's letters and the dichotomy with the Apostolicon?
Well, I think it's indisputable. I mean, I should say, a lot of scholars have disputed that Acts, the author of Acts, whether he knows Paul's letters, but I think it's indisputable that he did, because he uses them to reconstruct the so-called history of Paul in Acts, and he uses them to try to trace Paul's route, try to trace his journeys, and all of that. You just don't make that up out of whole cloth. You have the letters to help you piece together a kind of history. And, all of the cities to which Paul writes to in the letters, you see him going to in Acts. So there is that conjunction there. Now, what's interesting is that the author of Acts, I think quite deliberately so, does not want to portray Paul as a writer of letters. And that's a very interesting point. I mean, the only letter that Paul takes with him in the book of Acts is a letter written by the 12 apostles, supposedly in Jerusalem, telling Gentiles what they can and cannot do. And so I read this as kind of the attempt to revise Paul, because if you know Marcion's Paul is chiefly the letter writer, is chiefly the writer of Galatians and Romans and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, etc. And that's the Paul that Marcion emphasized. Whereas the revised version of Paul is not a letter writer, and he's sort of subordinate to the 12 apostles in Jerusalem. And the author of Acts buries any hint that Paul had any conflict with the so-called pillars in Jerusalem, which he talks about in Galatians. But he picks and chooses other stuff that he takes from Galatians. For instance, the idea that Paul was a Pharisee, he probably takes from Galatians. The idea that Paul was, Jewish and part of the tribe of Benjamin, and that he tried to destroy the church before he was converted. All of this stuff derives from Galatians, where Paul gives a sort of mini biography in Galatians 2. So you can tell the author of Acts is reading Galatians, but quite selectively, and then quite deliberately trying to say that Paul is subordinate to the Jerusalem apostles, that he didn't write any letters. And that kind of controls the interpretation of the letters. Because in the early Catholic version of what came to be known as the New Testament, you hit Acts, or you read Acts before you read any of the other letters. And this is true in New Testaments today. So what the Book of Acts does is it controls your reading of the letters. It gives you a kind of picture and portrait of who Paul was, so that when you go read the letters, you've already kind of framed it in a, shall we say, a particular way, and then bada bing, bada boom, you're unable to conceive of other interpretations of Paul, among them the Marcionite interpretation of Paul, which has him renouncing Judaism, renouncing circumcision, saying that the God of the Hebrew Bible is not the same as the Father of Jesus Christ. You're already trained to read against that if you're reading the Paul and Acts.
Can you tell us a bit about Cerinthus?
Yeah, Cerinthus is another really important early Christian for everybody to understand. And there's kind of two versions of Cerinthus. There's what might be called the Jewish Christian version of Cerinthus, that he's a kind of millenarian individual who envisions the world ending and us, Christians, sort of like modern fundamentalists, Christians being given some kind of paradise existence and enjoying the new Eden, and there's that kind of Cerinthus. And then there's the sort of Gnostic Cerinthus, and this is the Cerinthus that makes the distinction between the God of the Hebrew Bible, or just say the Lord of the Hebrew Bible, namely Yahweh, or Yahweh as the Greeks put it, and the true supreme deity, and that is the Father of Jesus Christ. And this Gnostic Cerinthus also had what's called a possessionist Christology, which means that he didn't think that Jesus was an incarnation of a deity. He thought that Jesus was a regular dude, but that at his baptism he was inhabited by a deity, inhabited by a divine spirit, in the form of a dove, that sort of came in and sort of like got sucked into his body. And then from that point on, he became the Christ and had all these superpowers. And then when he died, the divine energy or substance left him, and he died as a normal dude. And so that's Cerinthus, the Gnostic, and this Cerinthus also supposedly believed that the angels created the world. But interestingly enough, this tradition of the angels creating the world is really just old Jewish tradition. So you could tag that as part of the Jewish Christian Cerinthus. Some other interesting aspects of Cerinthus, I think. Well, first of all, I should say that I think the Gnostic and Jewish Christian Cerinthus are completely compatible. That you can have both and so we don't have to pick or choose. The other interesting thing about Cerinthus is that in later tradition, from late 2nd century, he was accused of writing the Gospel of John, and at least by the mid 3rd century, he was also accused of writing the Book of Revelation. Now, if that is in fact true, that would be quite astounding. I myself don't hold this view, but it's interesting to understand the reasons why those in antiquity did hold this view. I mean, if you look at the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is well aware, I think, of other Gospels which portray the divine birth or conception of Jesus, but he chooses not to portray Jesus as being born. He completely skips over Jesus's birth and childhood as if it was completely unimportant. And he has Jesus being inhabited by a divine spirit at the baptism, and then breathing out this divine spirit at the end when he's on the cross. That's quite interesting. I mean, that could certainly be interpreted as a possessionist Christology. I think that that's at least worth looking into, and I think that there's probably good reason to believe that Cerinthus, who was from the area of Asia Minor, which is probably where the Gospel of John was written, that he was a reader of John, that John informed his theology, but obviously in the 2nd century, they didn't have the Bible as we did. The Gospels floated around as individual texts. So if you were only reading John, well, then, I mean, your theology would be different than if you were reading, the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Matthew. And yeah, they kind of Well, like they do today, they pick and choose today, but it was even more extreme in antiquity because these books weren't read together. They were all individually, in pieces. And the reason why Cerinthus was connected to the book of Revelation is because the book of Revelation, is really the one single book that has become in the New Testament that speaks of the millennium. People still don't really know what that is or what that means, but it's just this 1,000-year period supposedly when Christians or Christian martyrs, sort of live it up on earth, on a new earth and a new Eden, and eat all this food and drink all this wine and enjoy life. And it was thought that Cerinthus was really promoting this millennium stuff, and so it was logical to connect him with the authorship of Revelation. So we can see why those statements were made, and it's interesting that they were made, because the overwhelming tradition is to try to say that both the Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation are written by the same dudes, supposedly John, but no one really knows who that John is. He never identifies him. I mean, he never names himself in the Gospel. And the John in Revelation never, refers to himself as anything else but John. Is it John, son of Zebedee? Is it John Smith? It's just a random John, which is a very, common Jewish name and still is. It's just been integrated into English. So we have no idea who this is, only that he was, supposedly in prison on Patmos. And that's it.
And what do you make about the claim that Cerinthus actually was an opponent of Paul, and that he was the leader of the opposition against Paul in Galatia?
Well, I don't make much of that because they live in different times. It is worth pointing out that Cerinthus is very, very early by, in terms of historically, that he bridges the first and second century. So he's probably born in the late first century, and he really thrives, it seems, around 120, 130. So he's extremely early. There's no doubt about that. But he's definitely a generation after Paul. And if anything, I would say that his distinction between the Jewish creator and the Father Jesus Christ, that's a Pauline distinction. Marcion was reading Paul that way. It wouldn't be surprising if Cerinthus was also reading Paul that way. But I think in terms of our documentation and our evidence, it seems that the text that Cerinthus was most familiar with was the Gospel of John. It doesn't seem like there are too many engagements with Paul at all, which isn't surprising for the early second century. This is something that I have to remind people of, and that in the early second century, there's not a lot of people quoting Paul at all. These early second century texts like Barnabas and First and Second Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, they don't really engage with Paul in any major way. Maybe First Clement, but really it's a surprising gap there. And it's really only with Marcion that kind of Paul takes off. And so that's another important contribution that Marcion makes. The legacy of Paul is really reinforced for everybody, and Paul becomes the most important apostle.
What do you make of Luke's gospel in relation to Marcion's gospel? You mentioned earlier that the author of Acts is probably the same person that inserted Luke chapters 1 and 2 into the gospel. But the rest of the gospel of Luke looks a lot like Marcion's gospel, has a lot of the same material. So what do you make of that?
Well, that's right. Yeah. Marcion's gospel and what became canonical Luke are a lot more similar than they are different. There's no doubt about that. They probably have about 80% similarity. But as I said before, we can see a editorial goal in the canonical Luke, and that is to reinforce Jesus's connection with Judaism, with Jewish traditions, with Jewish prophecies, and with Jewish figures. And that's a consistent editorial theme, that the things that appear in canonical Luke a lot of them are these kinds of traditions that reinforce Jesus's commitment to Judaism. Now, they do other things as well. The author of Canonical Luke had other interests. He was interested in political events, and political leaders. So, you see, for instance, in Luke 3:1, that Marcion's gospel mentions Tiberius and mentions Herod, but when you read Luke 3:1 in the canonical version, he's mentioned all these other people as well, including really obscure people, like obscure leaders who have nothing to do with the story. But he just sort of likes that sort of thing. And you can tell that also from the birth narratives, that he mentions Augustus and the census, and he mentions that Quirinius is the governor of Syria, and he's interested in that sort of stuff. He adds in the part that the Tower of Siloam fell down on a bunch of people randomly, and this, I believe, is in Canonical Luke 13. And he's interested in political events. It's clear that he's read Josephus, so he spices things up with some details, rather gory details, in the eschatological discourse that are taken from Josephus. These sorts of things we can tell that as an editor he's interested in, and so those are the sort of things that he adds. But I would say the overall kind of editorial goal is, yes, it's just to connect Jesus to Judaism and Jewish traditions, and that's the main editorial piece that he contributes.
Was the Pseudo-Pauline literature composed before Marcion's gospel was written or after?
Well, again, you have to look at a case-by-case basis. I would say Colossians and Ephesians are definitely before Marcion, okay, because Marcion had in his collection Colossians and what he called Laodiceans, but Laodiceans during his time was just the other name for Ephesians. It's really only after Marcion that it gets the name Ephesians. So we know that those letters were there in Marcion's collection. He didn't have a problem with them. He thought that they were genuinely Pauline. But it's these other letters, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, the pastoral epistles, that Marcion explicitly rejects. Certainly his followers do. And it's these letters that, again, seem to be actually arguing against Marcion. They argue against, they never name Marcion, because why would they? I mean, the author is pretending to be Paul, so Paul never heard of Marcion. But it's clear that, in certain things that they say, like, watch out for the spirits of deceit, they will forbid marriage. These are the sort of accusations that were thrown against Marcion, that he was forbidding marriage. Actually, technically, he didn't. Marcion encouraged celibacy, but he never tried to divorce people, or he never tried to keep people from being married. He encouraged married couples to be celibate, which means not have sex. But he didn't have any problem with a man and a woman living together. So these kinds of subtle distortions are there. But I think that the kinds of heresiological charges that are brought against Marcion, that he dissolves marriages, which can't be true because he has a gospel with Jesus saying that you can't divorce, and he's got Paul saying the same thing in 1 Corinthians 7. Do not divorce. So he's not encouraging people to divorce. He's not dissolving marriages. But at the same time, that's what heresiologists are accusing him of doing, because he's trying to be more strict in his attitude towards sexuality. So with that in place, whoever's writing the pastoral epistles is basically sounding like the heresiologists, saying that, yeah, I'm writing against, people who forbid marriage. Well, who's that? I mean, we're just looking at the contemporary literature of, who fits that accusation, and that seems to be Marcion. And as I mentioned at the end of 1 Timothy, you have the antitheses passage, which seems to refer directly to the work Antitheses written by Marcion. So those definitely come after Marcion, not long after, but after.
So in general, how did Marcion's arrival change second century CE Christianity?
Well, it changed it because he forced people to say, either you accept Paul or you reject him. There were Christians who came to the conclusion that Paul was evil. You read the Pseudo-Clementine letters or the Pseudo-Clementine works, and these are 3rd and 4th century works. And yeah, Paul's the enemy. I mean, you get rid of this guy. He's an absolute satanic force. And so that was an option for Christians. Interestingly, it's not the option that early Catholics took. They chose to embrace Paul and to include them. But Marcion forced them to make that decision and to create what became known as an authoritative collection of books called the New Covenant or New Testament. And Paul was in there front and center. But when you add Acts at the beginning of Paul's letters and the pastorals at the end of Paul's letters, well, the Paul you get is quite different. It's all about synthetic reading. They don't try to totally destroy Marcion's contribution, which is to put Paul front and center, but they frame Paul, Acts in front, pastorals in the back, and they try to say, oh, well, the true Paul is really the Paul of the pastorals, who's this very conservative dude. Or the true Paul is the Paul of Acts, who, is this law-abiding, very friendly with Jews and Jewish traditions and Jewish rites. And heck, he even does a Nazirite vow and, circumcises Timothy. So when you have that Paul framing what's in between, it's sort of like they've created a new sandwich. And that's radical. But the very fact that Paul's in there at all wasn't a historical necessity. A lot of people think, it was somewhat inevitable that the New Testament would be created eventually. But Marcion really got the ball rolling, and he forced the early Catholics to accept Paul. Whereas, we could imagine a world kind of like counterfactual history where Marcion didn't exist, and the Catholics got around to making the New Testament in the 4th century, and it didn't include any of Paul. It just included the Gospel of Matthew and John, and the letters of Ignatius and the Shepherd of Hermas, and the letter, the Catholic epistles like 1st and 2nd Peter, and maybe the Book of Revelation, and that was the New Testament, and Paul just wasn't in there. But the reason why we have Paul in there, and the reason why he's Mr. I wrote half the New Testament, is because of Marcion. That's a huge legacy.
So now I would like to shift to the Nicolaitans. What do we know about them?
The Nicolaitans, Nicolaitans are again another really interesting group, and I have my own particular theories about what's going on with the Nicolaitans. So basically, they're first mentioned in the Book of Revelation, and they appear in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, and they appear to be this group that is rather free, like a Pauline group that is rather free with eating sacrificed meat, that is meat sacrificed to Greco-Roman deities. And they seem to be a little bit more loose, as it were. And interestingly enough, the later heresiologists, it takes them about 100 years after Revelation, but later heresiologists, after Irenaeus, they pick up the Nicolaitans, and they start generating this backstory, apparently out of their own heads. We don't know what kind of historical data they had, but they had at that point the Book of Acts, and they said, oh, look at this. There's a guy named Nicholas in the Book of Acts. So he must be the leader of the Nicolaitans, right? Well, not really, but okay, you could make a story about that. And that's what they do. They make a story about Nicholas, who's one of the 7 deacons in Acts 6, who then he had this very beautiful wife, and he tried to sell her to the other apostles. And, it's a very interesting story told by Clement. And basically, he fell away from the faith and created this Christian sex cult. Basically, I mean, you'll have to read my book, Found Christianities. I mean, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And then this Christian sex cult ended up in Asia Minor, and they were then connected with the so-called Gnostic tradition, so that by the time you get to Epiphanius, you've got Nicolaitans being the sort of source and seed of the Gnostics. But that's late 4th century. So I think the Nicolaitans, they're a fascinating group, but really what we're looking at is an exercise in the heresiological imagination, right? We're looking at how heresiologists, that is, writers against so-called heretics, how they operate and how they sometimes imagine data and make up data, frankly, and make networks that just were not there, or make conclusions based on the Bible by connecting the dots. And a lot of Christians do this today. They kind of connect dots. Because there's a lot of gaps. And so if you can connect enough dots, you can make another kind of story. And out of that other interesting, different story, you can basically rewrite church history, which, arguably is also what the author of Acts did. So, I mean, that's what's going on. I don't personally think that outside of Revelation, the Nicolaitans had any real existence. I think it's all a fabrication. But others will disagree with me. Read the book. It's one of the better chapters, honestly. Tell me what you think.
All right. What can you tell us about the early Syrian teachers?
Well, early Syrian teachers are really important because these are the actual people like Saturninus, especially, who's very early in the 2nd century. And sometimes he's called Saturnil. And we can trace him. He's in Antioch, which is the big city, 3rd biggest city in the Roman Empire, big, boisterous place. And he is one of the first people who really makes this distinction, very similar to Cerinthus, that the God of the Jews, or the Jewish Lord, is really just a big angel, and he's actually not very nice, and he's not the Father of Jesus Christ. And it's him combined with 7 or 6 other angels to form a team of 7 who create the world, but that they are actually evil, and that the reason Jesus came is to overthrow the regime, the set of laws and regulations of this local Judean Lord, and that's the point why Jesus came. And so that's why, in the Gospels, Jesus is constantly violating the rules, violating the Sabbath, not washing his hands, eating unkosher things, and doesn't really care because he's actually, and healing on the Sabbath, because he's actually quite intentionally doing all these things because he wants to spite and thwart this local Judean demigod. And that's a very interesting reading of Christianity and the Christian message. Obviously, it didn't become the Orthodox reading, but I think that what's really important about these Syrian teachers is that they are the ones, as Saturninus is the one that's closest to texts like the Gospel of Judas and later the secret book of John, where we can see that early Christians are kind of expanding the narrative. And, because all that we have of Saturninus is just a heresiological report in Irenaeus, basically, we don't know the full extent of his thought. But the fact that his ideas show up and are expanded later indicates that if we're looking for the origins of Gnosticism, well, he's a major, major figure. And, again, counterfactual history, if his form of Christianity won out, boy, how would things look different? It's fascinating to think about that. But that regional variant of Christianity, the Syrian variant, he was unsuccessful in, making that universally plausible. But interestingly, that wing of Christianity, which is generally called Gnostic, was very strong and vibrant, far into late antiquity and survives in our own time. So it's never really dead. It's never really died. And what Christians need to do is, if that's what you think, if that's the reason, Jesus came to free us from an evil master, if that was the point of his coming, understand who's the first person to come up with that. That appears to be Saturninus. And that's even prior to Marcion, probably. And, one of the great mysteries of early Christianity is, who's talking to who? Because there's this tradition that Cerdo is the teacher of Marcion, and that Cerdo comes from Syria. Now, unfortunately, we have to depend on Epiphanius for that information, and Epiphanius is in the late 4th century, and he's often unreliable. But if he was right, maybe there is some connection between Saturninus and Marcion. Maybe these people really were in conversation. And if we could prove that, that would surely be fascinating. But unfortunately, we can't.
Why did the Simonians believe that Simon was the Christ?
Well, I'm not sure we can determine why they believe that, but it seems to be in the late 2nd century this development occurred where Christians, they kind of all agreed that Jesus lived in Judea and he had this ministry and he was the revelation of God. And Simonians who were Christians were trying to absorb that message, but trying to say that there was a kind of tiered level of revelation. They tried to say that, well, yes, Jesus was the revelation of God in Judea, but Simon was the revelation of God in Samaria. And actually, the way that they put it was it's kind of like Trinitarian. They said Jesus is the revelation of the Son, Simon is the revelation of the Father, and then after Simon, the Spirit comes among the nations. But all three manifestations of God are really the same power, functioning at different frequencies, as it were. That the greatest revelation is the revelation of the Father made by Simon in Samaria. But since Father, Son, and Spirit are in a sense one, then the power that was incarnate in Simon, Simon was the avatar of the same power that was in Jesus. And so everything that could be said about Jesus could then be said about Simon, right? Because they were incarnations or avatars of the same divine power, a Trinitarian power, but the same divine power. So if Jesus was the Messiah, then yes, Simon was also the Messiah. And that's eventually what Simonians came to say. They just absorbed everything that was said about Jesus can also be said about Simon.
Did Simon the Mandarin and Saturninus view God, and how different were their views from one another?
Well, they seem to have all independently used this Jewish tradition that the world was not created by the supreme deity, but was created by a team of angels. And Saturninus is the first one who says that there were exactly 7 angels. And that the chief one of these angels was the God who gave the law at Sinai to the Jews. So that chief angel chose the Jews as his special people. And they all concluded that the God that Jesus revealed was not part of that team of angels and had really nothing to do with that sort of local demigod, but that the God that Jesus revealed was a God of love and kindness. And this is something we especially see in Marcion. And that loving kindness, that character of pure and unmotivated love, was the true manifestation of God, who is the Father. And that the creator or cosmocrator, as Marcion called him, is just sort of like a local middle management sort of a figure who is getting too big for his britches and presenting himself as a kind of superior deity. And that's actually not the case. He's actually just middle management, sort of like that annoying boss at work who, thinks he's like the CEO, but, or he walks around like he's the CEO, but really he's just, part of the middle management answering phones. And, but he's over you. And that's the important part. He can make your life quite miserable. That's sort of like how these early Christians began to view the cosmocrator, Yahweh or Yahweh, if you prefer. And so for them, salvation came to be a kind of liberation. It wasn't, Jesus, it wasn't a kind of atonement. They didn't think that the blood magically purified them. The purpose for Jesus' coming was so that he could just free us from this really, really, really bad boss. Or as you would say in antiquity, from this really bad master who tried to enslave all of us. And we don't really belong to him. That's, I would say, generally where these thinkers are going. It's in terms of the model of salvation, this is a kind of what theologians would call a Christus Victor model. That is, Jesus comes as the victorious warrior who dominates and defeats the powers of this world, and then purchases us or redeems us. That's what redeem means. It means to actually purchase us, as in a slave market, and bring us to the heavenly kingdom. That's Jesus's mission.
All right, let's take a super chat question. Okay, super chat. Beast and the apathy of the Church of Osios David, a parallel to the griffins, cherubim, flanking the tree of life on Phoenician walls.
Well, thanks, JC. I have to say, this is just scholarly humility. I have no idea. And I think it's a fascinating question. I don't know much about the Church of the Osios David. I'd love to learn more if you want to send that to me. I think, and generally speaking, we can say that in terms of modern instantiations of religion and Christianity in particular, there's not much that really is newly invented. A lot of these symbols and ideas are just kind of recycled from antiquity. So, I wouldn't be surprised that, you would have bird imagery that was recycled and reused, or, birds looking like angels with wings turning into birds in the iconography. It wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not at all qualified to answer this one, but I really appreciate you asking, and please follow up.
Let's take the next one. JC again. Thank you for your super chat. Is the proto-Aleo capital iconography derived from the Tree of Life iconography from Phoenician balls?
Well, this is a question I would definitely direct to an art historian. I think that the issue here is I'm going to be primarily dealing with text. This is an iconographic question. I think that it would be difficult. I think, again, I'm not an expert, but I think this one would be difficult to prove. Maybe. I think when you're talking about influence and derivation, it's a little bit tricky here. But there are good scholars, and scholars whom I would recommend, like Martin West and Walter Burkert, who talked about some of how the Western iconography and mythology is dependent on Eastern stuff from Phoenicia and further east. Greeks themselves have in their mythology that Cadmus, who founds the city of Thebes in central Greece, is really a Phoenician, and they're aware that their alphabet is Phoenician. It wouldn't at all be surprising that iconography and iconographical objects from Phoenicia did influence Greece. It's just that I don't have any clear expertise in that particular area. But again, Jacob, you've got to have an art historian.
Right. Yeah.
That would be the right person to ask.
John, do you think if you super chat, why do you think Mark is more or less second century?
Well, I think all the Gospels are trying to do something very similar. That is, they're trying to pose as elite literature in a time where other texts are appearing, other biographies of holy men are appearing, and they are like Apollonius of Tyana. And so they're trying to compete with other contestants, basically. And they're trying to up their ante and create a kind of register of language that would impress not just an internal audience, but an external one. And Mark is sort of like the first try at Christians going for elite literature, in this case, biographical literature. And we really don't see this that much in the first century at all. I mean, again, there's the argument that, you know, the earliest Christians, of course, they felt no need for the Gospels because, well, they just assumed that Jesus was coming and that there was no point in, you know, writing these very long and time-consuming works of literature. I mean, you know, if you think Jesus is coming tomorrow, frankly, why bother? I mean, nobody writes a novel on a sinking ship. You know, you just try to get a life jacket. But, you know, the question is, how long were Christians thinking this way? How long, you know, and it seems like they thought this way pretty far up until the first century. And so that's why I say that, you know, we can't prove any of this. You know, this isn't kind of like hard data and hard science. The only thing that we can prove is, you know, Mark is aware probably of the destruction of the temple in 70. But I find no compelling reason to think that, you know, he's like, oh, the day after 70. I mean, no, I mean, you know, he's looking at these events from a distance, I think. And I think he's at a time period where, you know, this is the first kind of experiment of doing this high elite kind of literature. And he's the guinea pig. He's the experimenter. So I would put that, you know, again, early second century, but still second century. And then, of course, you know, as time moves on, you know, I'd love to write a book called Redating the New Testament, and, you know, not from a conservative direction, as it often is, where, you know, conservatives, evangelicals try to downdate these letters, you know, like to, like, you know, the day after Jesus died, you know, or, you know, they try to downdate the book of Acts, you know, to Paul's lifetime because it doesn't mention Paul's death. Well, I mean, why would you think that? That's sort of like making the argument that, oh, a biography of Abraham Lincoln that doesn't mention his death must have been written in 1864. I mean, it just does not make any sense whatsoever. Anywho, thank you, John.
John D's got another super chat. Do you think a major revision or two, one by Marcion and one against Marcion of Paul's letters in the second century, is a serious possibility?
Yeah, I definitely do. Yeah, I mean, so it's certainly the case that the early Catholic edition of Paul's letters does look different than Marcion's edition. That's not necessarily because Marcion was in there, you know, trying to change everything that disagreed with him theologically. No, obviously he doesn't do that. I mean, one of the great advances of Marcionite scholarship is that we've noticed that, you know, Marcion has no problem when, you know, Paul cites Old Testament scripture or Jesus cites Old Testament scripture. I mean, that happens occasionally. You know, it's not a problem for Marcion. He doesn't think that, you know, Paul and Jesus aren't Jewish or that they aren't familiar with the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. He does think that. But we know that, and, you know, in the late first century and early second century, they were different versions of different texts, you know. Even today, you know, the modern scholars, many of them, you know, if they're not conservative or evangelical, they tend to see the letter of 2 Corinthians as a combination of several letters, or the letter of Philippians as a combination of several letters. And maybe there was at some time an edition of Paul's letters that in which there were 4 or 5 letters to the Corinthians. And then as the editions came together, or as were transcribed and kind of solidified and edited, that people just decided to bring these letters together for whatever reason. And the problem is, in all of this, the late 1st century and the early 2nd century are this big black hole. We have zero evidence. We have nothing, absolutely nothing in terms of manuscript evidence. So what's going on in this period is a complete black hole. So that's the problem. But yes, to answer your question, absolutely. Now, I should say, Jacob, that I don't know how many more super chats that we have, but I'm happy to answer all remaining super chats. But I do have to go at some point, just for family reasons. But
Sure.
yeah, fire away if there are more. Happy to
There's
take
one
them.
more.
Sure thing. Yep.
Pravin Paul, thank you for your super chat. Robert Price has suggested that Simon Magus and Paul are the same person, Paul just being a proto-Orthodox sanitization of Simon. Your thoughts, please.
Yep, definitely wrong. This is based on a 19th century theory by Ferdinand Christian Bauer. And, I would read Bauer before reading Price on this one. It's just kind of like an argument he takes from Bauer. Based on the Pseudo-Clementine literature. And recall that Pseudo-Clementine literature is 3rd and 4th century. Okay. You'll be glad to know, Pravin, that I've got my book on Simon of Samaria that is now available for you to get on Amazon. It's from Bloomsbury, in which I go through this evidence. And I talk a little bit about this in my book, Desiring Divinity, as well. So I have a lot to say about this. I think that, if you're asking this question historically, definitely Simon and Paul are different people. We could ask the question just in terms of, pure literary terms. Was the author of the Pseudo-Clementine literature trying to say that Simon has absorbed the character of Paul and is just a stand-in for Paul? Well, that may be, but the problem is that the Simon of the Pseudo-Clementine literature, he's absorbed several other figures and characters, and a lot of what he says isn't at all consistent with Paul. So we have to deal with that as well. But yeah, go try to find my book, Simon and Simon of Samaria. I'll have deals on that book for those who join my Patreon. And but that's fresh, hot off the press. So take advantage.
Right. I just have one last question, my closing question, if you have time.
Sure.
Before we close out. In relation, again, going back to the relationship between Marcion and Luke's gospel, do you date Matthew before Marcion's gospel? And if you do, is Luke, in your view, using Marcion's gospel? And are they both using Matthew?
Well, I think it's definitely the case that by the time that the author of Canonical Luke is sitting down to revise what might be called Proto-Luke, okay, which isn't exactly the same as Marcion's gospel. Again, my theory is the same theory as John Knox, that there is a Proto-Luke, if you want to call it that, but I would just call it a gospel. And that Marcion takes this gospel, transcribes it, and attaches it to the Pauline letters. And that as a secondary counterpunch, the author of the Canonical Luke doesn't take Marcion's version specifically, but he takes the Proto-Luke, which is the basis for Marcion's text, and he changes and revises it, making it, much more, for lack of a better term, Jewish. But that's, he makes it much more like Matthew, and he probably has Matthew. I'm fairly certain of that. So Matthew's available certainly by the mid-2nd century. We know that because Justin Martyr quotes it. Matthew might have been around for Marcion to observe around the year 130 or 140. I don't actually have a firm date, but all that we know is that Marcion rejected Matthew. We don't know when he first encountered it, but certainly by 150 it was in existence, and it did definitely inform the revision of canonical Luke. Yes.
Let me ask another part to that question. Does Proto-Luke know Matthew as well, in your view, or you're not so sure about that?
That's a possibility, yeah. I mean, for people who are skeptical of the Q hypothesis, I think that that's a real possibility, definitely. I myself, I tend to be a Q skeptic, and in which case, if I haven't studied this independently. I'm not a Matthew scholar. In fact, Matthew has never been much of an interest of mine. But what I would say is if someone is going to be a thoroughgoing Q skeptic, then you have to imagine this scenario that the author of Proto-Luke knew Matthew and incorporated a lot of Matthean material, spread it around, and that then Marcion had access to this. Marcion and the author of canonical Luke had independent access to this Proto-Luke, and that Marcion's gospel may or may not have tried to kind of remove some of these Matthean elements. It's not very clear, but certainly that the author of canonical Luke tried to emphasize these Matthean elements. But again, we're getting into the weeds of things, and probably I just need to study this a bit more. Again, the Matthew side of the equation, I'm not an expert on. I'll have to punt somewhat on that question and do some further research.
Right. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Litwa.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and thanks to everybody who came along. I'll be doing a live session on my channel at the end of this week, so I'll be launching my Marcion course then. I hope to see many of you there. But for now, I just want to thank Jacob for having me back on the channel. This is an exciting opportunity, I think, for History Valley, and it's good to see this channel growing and making a difference. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Litwa. It was good having you.
Definitely. Take care.
You too.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.